welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Turn the Page. I'm your host today, Jen, and I am joined by a poet and writer who brought to me a gorgeous volume of poetry, a beautifully packaged gift set. And I'm so happy that she's agreed to this interview and that we get to talk about it. So hello, welcome to the show. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book?
Thank you. I'm Lauren Martin. I'm a poet and actually a psychoanalyst and a shaman. And so this book, I've been writing poetry since I was a really little kid. I had this really strange experience in, I think it was sixth grade, in which I wrote something very unrelated, some sort of essay. And I got pulled out of my class and put into a poetry writing class. And so from that point on, I was writing and studying poetry all the way through college. Didn't necessarily see myself as a poet. I mean, it sort of just came out of me, and thought that I would compile a poetry book or some sort of compilation after school, and got caught up in a series of things, professional training, Lyme disease, and a very arduous shamanic journey. So I never really came back to it until, I continued to write, but I never compiled anything until I was very badly injured in 2015 and bedridden. So that was a forced opportunity.
Wow. Yeah, you've done a lot of really interesting things that are, in quite different areas, but all seem to fit together in really interesting ways. So could you talk a little bit about, how psychotherapy, shamanism, and poetry kind of fit together for you? What are the boundaries? Are there boundaries? And do you see them all sort of working toward similar aims?
It's such a great question. I always say to my clients that I feel like being in a therapeutic process is a shamanic journey, and that we are going to enter into the dark night of the soul together, and they won't be alone, and that I'm going to help usher them out of it. That there's this profound reparenting experience. So I think the boundaries of shamanism and poetry, in which I talk about my own experiences with that kind of depth, and psychotherapy are very interwoven. I think that, fundamentally, as a good clinician, you need to be able to usher people into where it is the darkest. And as a shaman, you're interacting with the dead. And so you have to be able to be comfortable in that space and know that you can find your way out of it. And I think that's what leads to fundamental change in anything, whether it's psychological or spiritual or writing.
That's so interesting. And the way that you sort of constructed that, it feels like all of those roles are sort of like tour guides or accompanying people through.
Privilege.
Yeah.
It's such a privilege. It's like I really love my work, and I just feel so moved by people's courage. And just unfortunately, human beings are not always kind to each other, and people have such courage to look at that and to let me be witness to it, and to trust me. And I think that's why to me, it's so important that people train, and people don't train as much anymore, although they want to be experts and they're interested, but it takes so long to be an expert. And I just think it's so important to do that training, because you are in there with people's souls. I think it really is, particularly with trauma. Trauma is so attached to the very essence and identity of people. So I feel like you're working with the soul, and you have to take that as a very sacred job.
Oh, wow. Yeah, and maybe that is sort of the work of all three areas. They do have to do with the soul. That's
Yeah.
really
Yeah.
um, let's talk a little bit about the book and the package that it arrived with. I was sent a gorgeous paperback with a really lovely cover and what you have called a swag bag. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what was in that swag bag, why you chose the items, and, does that speak to your intentions for the volume of poetry?
It's so smart. Well, it's funny because I was very intimidated by this idea of sending a swag bag because I'm not crafty. And I've seen people who have made cookies with images of their books on it. And I was like, well, this gorgeous cover is not going to be defamed by me trying to do that. Um, but then I started thinking, well, what is important to me? And what is important is the indigenous practice ifa and the materials that we use on a daily basis, which are so esoteric and beautiful and have different meanings. So I think I sent you efun, which is that ball of chalk, which is used as it's used in lots of things. It's used as a cooling agent. It's used as an absorber of negativity or of dark spiritual energy. And then I sent you cowries, which are, have forever been, historically were used as money. So they're very much a part of the tradition, and they get put in different ceremonial practices. And then I sent you kola nuts, OB and arugbo, two different kinds of kola nuts. One is bitter kola and one is the standard kola nut. And we divine with those on a daily basis. So every day has a different spirit, and then you throw these OB and they give you information about where your spirit is and how things are going. So I thought it might be interesting for people to see those very natural elements that are used on a daily basis.
Yeah, it's also a really interesting glimpse, I think, into the ways in which I think poetry maybe and shamanism both seek to find like the sacred in the everyday or in the mundane, and really about like collapsing those boundaries, right? Because like when you
Yeah,
look at things a certain way, everything can become sacred or significant. And
right.
it's a really nice sort of set of objects to kind of reflect through.
Right. And the fabric, which I sent you, has colors that are very much aligned with one particular Orisha Egbe. And every Orisha has its own color and has its own fabric. And it's just beautiful, the kind of reverence and adornment that, for me, my deepest relationships are with spirit. And I trust that to be available in all of these things. So, including my writing. People ask me, how do you craft? How do how do you know what style you're gonna use? And I am a medium, so I dream my poems. And I didn't really think that was so atypical, but I kind of wake up with the completed poem. Um, I make very few edits. I see them as expressions of the divine or of ancestors, somebody's ancestors. But, it even sometimes stuns me, like the poem, The Waiting Tree, which is such a long elegiac poem about the Chibok girl massacre. Um, I really felt like that came from somebody's grandparents speaking for those girls and mourning those girls, and not specifically from me. So I feel really lucky that way. My sister is my consummate editor. She peers over everything, but she mostly has not made huge edits. So I know it's atypical, but I never thought of it as atypical. You're just in your own reality.
Mhm. That is really interesting. And I wonder, your artistic process can kind of change once you start comparing it to other people's, so it is kind of,
Mhm.
it's very personal, and sometimes it is good to sort of work on it without that kind of other context or comparison. So in this volume, you explore themes of illness and shamanism, and how they can both create experiences of isolation and marginalization. And you use this to sort of link your personal experiences and your internal journey with this examination of the external world and this larger socio-political landscape. Could you talk a little bit about like connecting the personal to the sort of wider landscape of the world that we live in, and what topics were you trying to deal with that you see in the world as opposed to the inner journey part?
I feel like we really lack compassion, true compassion. I mean, we have kind of spun into a place of compassion for what we feel, not for things that are atypical to us. And I think we've always struggled with that around illness in specific. I mean, I think that's why it's become um, so disconnected from even medical reimbursement. Lyme is a disaster for people. And, you know, I think that experience is a psychological experience. I think people are afraid that something atypical could happen to them. And so they come up with a judgment or a belief system that allows them to distance themselves from people who are ill. And that's something that I've always thought, with regard to illness and regard to being marginalized or the environment. Those are feelings I've always had, even before I ended up disabled in bed for it was really 8 years. And um, I kind of felt as a small kid in my spiritual experiences that what was important to me was to try to share or understand the experience of other people and really hear who they were. And it is the thing that gives me tremendous joy. And then as my life developed with the intensity of my shamanic journey and my health problems, I felt that the world didn't really give that back to me. And so that's one of the things that I do write about. And then there are very specific things like, the poem Yemaja speaks to Scott Pruitt. I mean, Yemaja is the Orisha of the ocean. And so when he was put in power, somebody who had sued the EPA 14 times, as Attorney General, ends up the head of the EPA. I was so horrified and worried and thought, I mean, I'm always thinking about how do people disconnect themselves from the environment and the natural world, particularly, I mean, there are all these species that are becoming extinct and we are a species. So it just all feels like it's part of this psychological disconnect in which we can have compassion for things that really mirror us and our belief system, but not things that are outside of the norm. And that is a huge theme in my writing.
That's fascinating. Yeah, and I think that it does speak to, I think, how I think writing about both illness and politics has changed a lot, like in the past few years. With illness, I think especially
Yeah.
post 2020, we're
Yeah.
dealing with like very different sets of beliefs and intense emotions, I think, that people have around it. And I'm really captivated by this idea that we have trouble empathizing with both people who are unlike us and with the world that nurtures us. That's so
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. It really is. I mean, I think it's fear that drives that, that people really disconnect from things they're afraid will happen to them. And then they develop a belief system about that other thing. And, I'm a big believer in you have to work with everybody individually. My parents were very atypical and, they really were lovers of people and they were in public health. My mom was a social worker. I mean, they just were really committed to hearing other people and addressing people, good and bad, individually, and assessing that. And I think that's a phenomenal belief system and value system that I got from them. I feel really fortunate for that.
So you talked a little bit about your process and how the poems sort of come to you seemingly fully formed. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about you know, if you've ever been like really surprised by what has ended up on the page. Have you thought that a poem was about something but discovered that it was about something else halfway through? And like, does the process
Mm,
ever hold surprises or left turns for
yes.
you?
Well, there's one poem in the book, Impact, that was really hard for me. It was two poems, and I was very committed to reading two poems that didn't really work. And my sister was the one that was like, I think these go together. And she was really right. And she edited that. And I think it works so much better. And then we had a funny interaction around Ziggy, which is one of my favorite poems in the book. because I love Bowie, because it was so descriptive of an experience with a specific boyfriend. But what I loved about it, she really helped me with that as well. As I was kind of over wordy, as you are about any breakup. I had so much to say about it. And she slashed through some of my, kind of meaner lines. And she's like, you got to kill your darlings. And I'm like, I can't give up those lines. So we had this whole debate about it. And then I decided it looked great with the slash throughs. And, it was kind of a nice little mumble. And, when I've read it, I read it as a mumble under my breath. And I feel like it still describes an experience of that person that I felt was really useful. So yeah, there are these nice surprises in particularly in formatting and that, capture a certain emotional experience.
Oh, wow. Well, that's really actually, I think, lovely because poetry often surprises us, but I think David Bowie always surprised us. So that really is very fitting.
I mean, he eulogized himself. I mean, who eulogizes yourself? It's amazing.
Yeah.
He was always a pioneer and never to be controlled, always to have his own experience. And I resonated with him at a very young age. And when I by the time I was like 9, 10, you could not see a wall or a ceiling point in my bedroom. It was just all Bowie, Bowie, Bowie. It was a shrine. It was my first shrine, Bowie, and so all the way throughout his life, he did it his way. And I really admire that permission and example.
Mm, absolutely. And I think that, your poetry encouraged me to view him as something of a shaman too. There's a really beautiful line about him being
Great.
like a cosmic shaman, I think.
Oh,
Or galactic shaman, yes.
yeah.
Um, yeah,
Yeah.
he's just so singular. And I think he is, like, I think he also is a really great example of like breaking down or questioning all those borders between poetry, music, religion, shamanism, like really, really lovely. And that last album is just like so shocking that like what a
It
gift
is.
to give to the world, that's
I
about to
know.
leave you. Like it's
I know.
mhm.
But I think that is the thing. It's like, what do we leave here? Or, what do we want to say? And what does it bring in the long term? And, are we communicating something that has value over time and builds compassion? And he certainly did
Mm.
over and over and over again from the beginning to the end.
Oh, totally. And
Yeah.
talking a lot about fear, and all these other things, I'm wondering too if, with the lack of compassion that we're talking about in our current society and even all the environmental issues that we've brought up, I'm wondering if like a refusal to take that sort of long-term view that Bowie was so good at, is that because that process makes us vulnerable? Like if we think about the climate, we have to think about our long-term vulnerability, not just as individuals, but as, yeah, a species, and I think that
Yes.
vulnerability is also very hard for people in this era.
Yeah, I mean, I think to be vulnerable, you have to sit with not only what you're feeling in that moment, but be internal in whatever it is that you feel long term. And that is something that's really hard for people. And we have so many outs right now. I mean, there's so many permissive ways to anesthetize yourself that have been very normalized. And unfortunately, I think that moves us further away from empathy and compassion, which is kind of, the foundation of narcissism is really a lack of compassion for other people. And what's so striking about narcissists is that they can align with you if you're aligned with them, but as soon as you have a different experience, they can't. And I think that's what we're doing with the environment. That's what we're doing with other people. What we're doing generally. We're a big, big group here, and we all have really disparate ideas and thoughts and needs, and there needs to be space for that while we still kind of honor the ground that we're standing on.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we do also live in a world that um in which it is very easy and often incentivized to dissociate, to sort of remove your
Yes,
from the present moment. And I think that all
yes,
of the things that you're engaged in, the psychotherapy, the poetry, the shamanism are all about like presence in the moment too. Mhm.
yes. I've never really been able to um, live outside of what's really happening. It's been, a curse. My sister's always called me Cassandra, but I've never really been able to deny what's fundamentally happening in the moment. And I do think that's, how I was formed. I mean, I was like that as a child, and it's in all of my work. But I hope that it's allowed people to have better experiences in their lives because of it.
Mhm. Do you think you'll publish more poetry? Have you still been writing while waiting for this book to come out?
Yeah, I have another book that I think is basically done. It needs a good edit. I have a memoir that I have been editing for like 12 years, and it just seems like interminable in terms of trying to make it work. And I have a analytic relationship book that's 1/3 of the way through, and another book. I mean, I've just been writing.
Oh,
So
wow. Well,
yeah.
that's great. I'm so glad to see what you do next because I really enjoyed this volume of poetry. It was really beautiful, and it made me think about not just myself, but I think about, how I relate to the world and other people in it, which I think is what, a really good thing for poetry to do. So thank you for coming to talk to us about, yeah, all your life work. It's really lovely.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. And thank you for being so thoughtful about the book and your questions. It's really a pleasure. I really digested the work, and I really appreciate that.
Thank you. Listeners, it's now your turn. Please check out Night of the Hawk. By the time that you hear this, it will be available. So please head to your favorite independent bookstore, library, website, wherever you like to go for books. You're not going to regret it. Thank you so much for joining us. It is now time to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.